Welcome back to my final Best of the Year video talking about fantasy published in 2023. This is my 6th video along with a bonus video talking about holiday recommendations. So if you want to check out my playlist, link down below. All that being said, it's been a fantastic year for fantasy. While I consider myself to be more of a sci-fi gal, I find out that I like a lot of fantasy, at least a lot more than I think I do. So I have 10 great books to talk about. Let's get started. First, at the number 10 spot, we have Lost in the Moment and Found by Shauna McGuire. This is the latest book in the Wayward Children series. The original books in the series also made my backlist, so it's unsurprisingly that I also enjoyed this one. This follows a young girl who, right at the beginning of the story, it's not a spoiler, her father drops dead, and her mother then goes on to remarry someone else. That other person is abusive. The abuse is handled well in terms of the author attempting not to make the content overly triggering. It's not glamorized or sensationalized, but it's certainly there, so trigger warnings accordingly for those that need them. However, this story is a very harrowing one. It takes the concept of the series where it's always about children going through different portals to escape, and in this one, certainly the girl has some very understandable reasons for wanting to leave her life behind and go off to some fantastical place. In terms of a premise, I thought it was one of the best in the series. I am someone who's very fascinated by these dark topics. I think it's something that we don't see enough in fiction. Certainly it's not for everyone, but I think it's really important for these books to exist so people can see themselves on the page if they need to, or just talk about these important topics. So I love this one. I found it very emotional. It hit home for me and was a very difficult read in a very positive way, a story that really stuck with me and had that emotional impact that I'm looking for in my reading life. And so I personally recommend it. I actually read it before going back to the beginning of the series. So while I highly recommend the entire series, I do believe you can jump in here if the particular subject matter of this one drops your interest. At number 9, we have Night Angel Nemesis by Brent Weeks. This is the first book in the new series that follows up the original Night Angels trilogy. If you watch my backlist video, you might have noticed that I had that trilogy in there, so unsurprisingly I enjoyed the new one as well. You'll definitely see some trends in this video. And so I know the Dark Angel trilogy is not for everyone, and I liked it, recognizing the things about it that other readers criticize. A lot of those criticisms are valid. This one picks up the story where the other ones left off. I don't want to give away too much of the plot in case you want to read the original work, but for me, this one was the modern way to address the criticisms of the original trilogy. It really helped to smooth out some of the criticisms surrounding, say, the female characters and some of the parts about the story that people don't like. For me, if you enjoy the story, if you enjoy the banter, the characters, the tone of it, the action, this one really brought it all back. It's a series and a book that I think could have been wrapped up and completed in the original trilogy, but I enjoy the series so much that I was happy to continue on, spend more time with the characters. This one maybe doesn't have the same weight in terms of the story and plot as the original ones, but I just, again, love spending time with the characters, so I'm biased to really enjoy this one. It's a chunky monkey, but for me, it was totally worth my time. Then at number 8, we have Combat Code by Alexander Darwin, and this is the first book in a series that follows a young man who was a famed knight until he experienced a loss. And after that, he is going and trying to seek another life for himself. He ends up finding the opportunity to fight, hence the Combat Code title, and you see him within this martial combat setting. I often say that I'm not someone who enjoys action-based fantasy or action-based fiction in general, but maybe I need to change that because I had a great time with this one. I think for me it's the fact that, again, with something like martial combat, it's very close and intimate in terms of the description, so it's not these giant warring factions, but instead it is two individuals in a ring, and it feels, again, very close and personal. I found that the descriptions of the fighting were just very well done so that someone like myself who doesn't always understand the logistics of what I'm reading in terms of how people are physically moving their bodies made sense. I was very much engaged. I had a good time. It was such a page turner, had a lot of fun, and would definitely read more within the series. I think that it's just an enjoyable time. Gave me a slight reminiscent vibes of something like the Greenbone Saga, which is always a huge praise just in terms of, again, that martial combat. So if you enjoy something like this, if you're looking for perhaps a palate cleanser between some of the more large multi-scope epic fantasy stories you read, this is one I would recommend. Then at number 7, we have Elder Epoch, and this is the third book in an epic fantasy series that is inspired by the Crusades. A lot of the story takes place in another secondary world that feels very much like the Middle East. And this story, I can't really talk about the third book without spoiling what comes before. I loved the first book. gunmetal gods, and so have really enjoyed continuing on with the series. While I didn't entirely love book 2, it was just so different than book 1. For me, book 3 really brought it back to the characters and the plot and the setting that I love so much, and to me really focuses the series back on those elements that I just adored. I've said before that I really do enjoy settings that are a little bit different and have a very distinct feel to them, and I also really love the fact that this story involves some very morally gray characters. I think that was what really drew me to the series in the first place, and that comes back within this one, characters with complicated motivations and actions, and I love the shifting of perspectives and plotting, and so I just had a really good time with this one. It's a series that in my opinion doesn't get enough love online. I'd like to change that. Then at number 6, we have The Will of the Many by James Islington. And this is the first book in a new series and a very beloved book online. I think a lot of people will be shocked that it's not in my number 1 spot. I liked it, but there definitely were books that surpassed it this year. This book is very much inspired by the gladiator days by ancient Rome, and you see that influence within the story. We follow a young man who is an orphan. He gets the opportunity to go to this military academy. You find out that there is a reason he is sent there. There is something he is trying to find out. There's a mystery involved, and that for me is what really drew me into the story. I found the main character to be an interesting individual, but once you get into the individual politics of trying to maneuver through the school, not knowing who to trust, and trying to figure out who is all behind what is happening, that is when I really got invested in the story. I also enjoyed a lot of the qualities surrounding the plot, so I found the characters to be, again, well-developed, complex, morally gray, and interesting to follow. The world building was fascinating, definitely inspired by, again, ancient Rome, but doing so in a way that really felt like its own. And I found the writing to be very pleasing. I'm not someone who always appreciates or respects or notices prose, but in this case, I really felt like the author has matured since their debut novels, and I was excited to see what they were doing within here. So I really like this one a lot. Again, a solid 4 stars for me, which did make the list. For a lot of people, I'm sure you're going to see it in the number 1 spot. Didn't quite make it for me, but that's just because I loved so many things this year. It was hard to narrow it down, but making the list says quite a lot. Now, breaking into the number 5 spot, we have The Judas Blossom by Stefan Aaron. This is a book that takes place in Persia in, I believe, the 1200s, and we follow a few different perspectives, including one person who is the descendant of Genghis Khan. I found this particular time period quite interesting for a choice in terms of Mongolian culture, because everything else I've read that is based around Mongolia specifically follows the life of Genghis Khan himself and not what comes afterwards. So while I have read a lot about his life, I was a little less familiar with this time period, and I found it very interesting to learn those tidbits along the way. I am fascinated by the culture of Mongolia as it was, so I enjoy learning about that. I liked the characters. I thought it was interesting. There is magic within the story, but it is definitely heavy in the historical fiction element, so know that going into it. But I like this one. If I had something that I would love to see in the future books, is just for the books to be longer and more drawn out, because I actually feel like there is so much to digest and dissect within a story like this, and I would love to see even more time spent on that world building. But this book as a debut was so strong, really caught my attention, something special, and obviously again, it made the list, so I love it. Then at number 4, we have The Water Outlaws, and this is a story that is largely inspired by the style of Uwaksa, if I'm pronouncing that somewhat right. This is a story that follows a group of warriors, specifically a group of female warriors who were once soldiers that are now outlaws and doing and committing their own justice as they see fit. This is a story that I really love because of my love for a lot of traditional Chinese-inspired work, both in terms of fantasy or just historical fiction. It is a time period and a place and a culture that I just find to be very interesting to read about. And so if you love stories like The Three Kingdoms, or more so things I would say along the lines of A Hero Born, one of my other favorite fantasy series from past years, this one definitely draws into that, but instead actually brings in more of a female perspective, which unsurprisingly is often missing from something that is more historically accurate, since the women were often staying at home and it was the men who were out in the field. So I love this kind of queer bent, strong female story woven into a culture and a time period that I just love reading about. So this book, you can tell, was just written for me. I adored it. It was action-packed and fun and fast and just a lot of fun. So highly recommend it if you have similar buzzwords to me. Now at number 3, we have The Basilisk Throne by Greg Keyes. And this is the first book in what I would describe as a grim-dark series. It is a piece of epic fiction or epic fantasy that's told over multiple perspectives. We follow this father and son who are traveling on the sea, so there's that seafaring aspect, which I love in stories. There's also a daughter who is sent off to go to this other nation to create favor there. And then we also get this story right at the beginning of this character who is under the thumb of a man. There's a lot of the abuses that come with that, and that is where I really would describe this book as having a similar feel to something like a Game of Thrones, where you have terrible things happening to characters and is woven into the story. For some people, that is a complete no, a complete turnoff for a book, but I actually strangely enjoy when a book has that dark realism. I think those things exist and happen today in our world. And so while I love the escapistness that comes with fantasy, I rather honestly prefer it to draw from things and not paint a rosy, perfect picture. So if you are someone like me who likes a story that challenges you, that has these morally gray characters and has people in difficult situations and having to work their way out, I like this. There's a few things in terms of the characters and some of the plot development in terms of relationships that weren't entirely to my taste, but as a debut novel, this was very strong. Again, it made the number 3 spot, so I can't criticize it too much. Definitely excited to read more in this series. I love the time at sea. The characters were very memorable and I just want more. Then at the number 2 spot, barely missing the top tier, is He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan. This is the second and final book in the duology that started with She Who Became the Sun. That was one of my favorite books. I think it was my favorite book from the year that it was published in terms of fantasy. So in the first book, we follow a young girl who at the beginning of the story, something happens to her family. She is told that she will have no luck, no life by this fortune teller. Then when something happens to her family, she goes and takes on the identity of her brother. She goes off to this monastery. There she is learning and training and lives through his identity from then on. The story is a piece of historical Chinese fiction, so it is very much drawing from the different unrest and political maneuvering at that time, and there are just very light elements of fantasy within the story. She can potentially see ghosts, and that is woven into the story in a very natural, subtle way, which is quite enjoyable. I actually really enjoy fantasy that is more low rather than hugely fantastical things. I enjoyed this follow-up book quite a lot. I think I do still enjoy the first book, but in terms of finale, this one really hit the marks. I really couldn't think what I would want from this book that it didn't provide. It is a strong book that focuses obviously on the character growth and getting to see the final part of their arc as they rise through the military. Within this book, you get to see what comes of their life and everything and that ensues. And I just thought it was a solid sequel to a series and duology that I love. And so highly recommend, if you read the first book, you do want to finish it up. This is a strong duology, and I really love duologies because, again, there is no middle book, there is no fat, there is nothing extra. There is a strong start and a strong finish and nothing in between. So highly recommend, if you share my taste for Asian-inspired fantasy, this is one of the best. And finally, at the number 1 spot, the book that nothing could beat all year is The Tyranny of Faith by Richard Swan. This is the second book in the series that starts with The Justice of Kings. And I really love the first book, but I somehow love this second book even more. I'm often someone who tends to prefer the first books in series. So for this book to champion and be even better than the first definitely says a lot to its strengths. In the first book, we follow this man who is the justice for the king. So he goes around the countryside and he investigates and proclaims the justice and makes the consequences that come with that. However, what makes the story interesting is that it's actually told from the perspective of his scribe. So we see the story from the side of this young woman who follows him and tells his story. Within the story, there are really interesting elements of dark magic, which I found to be quite creepy and interesting and serve the story very well. I know other people do not love the character of Helena. They find her a bit whiny or young. I never had an issue with that in the first book, but I would say that you see a lot of character growth in this one. So if that was an issue before, I do think that you will have that reconciled here. In terms of the character growth, the relationships, the advancements of the plot, I love the elements in this one. I was completely hooked in. There was a particular chapter that just had me fangirling, as I've continued to hint about every time I talk about this book. Highly recommend it, but absolutely you gotta go back to the beginning, start at the start, and I hope you love this series as much as I do. I am dying for the third book, which I think will be the final one, but I'm also fine if the series just keeps going for a while. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please let me know, what was your favorite fantasy book published in 2023? And if you want to stick around, subscribe. I do read a lot of fantasy as well as science fiction, horror, thrillers, and other dark things. If you want to give this video a thumbs up, I appreciate it. If you want to drop a comment, even if just in a little emoji representing something fantastical like a dragon or a princess or a knight. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.